We would like to welcome everybody to the first of our Avoca 2021 John Lee quarterly webinar series. This is a new webinar series that will begin this year. In a moment, I will welcome Patty Lushton, Avoca's CEO, who is going to introduce the John Lee webinar series. The first of these is around clinical quality management systems and optimizing that within the context of updated and ongoing changes to regulations, some of those being imposed by COVID-19 and the resultant adjustments, but also others beyond that. Today, I will be doing the presentation. My name is Steve Whitaker. I've been with the Avoca Group and with the Quality Consortium for a number of years since its inception in 2011, and have multiple years of industry experience in clinical research, clinical development, clinical operations. I'm going to hand it over to Patty Lushton here to introduce the John Lee webinar series. Patty?
Hi, everybody. I'm Patty Lushton. Thank you so much, Steve. So we're launching this webinar series in honor of John Lee. John was the Vice President of Clinical Operations at Spectrum Pharmaceuticals, and sadly, John passed away suddenly last fall. One of the reasons we wanted to honor John with this webinar series is because he was really passionate about kind of closing learning gaps. He was passionate about education of the clinical trials community. And he was a great supporter of our Quality Consortium. We started the consortium about a decade ago. John was one of the early people that I called. I actually didn't know John. I was given his name, so it was kind of a cold call. And I described our vision to bring companies together to drive change through collaboration. And very quickly, John said, "Count me in." He just really embodied this whole spirit of working together as an industry to move things forward. Next slide, please. I wanted to include this photo of John because I think it captures his sense of humor, his spirit. He had a very big personality. He was a lot of fun to work with. He brightened up the room when he would walk in. Before I turn it over to Steve, just one really quick story. John was visiting us at our offices here in Princeton, New Jersey. This was before COVID. We took a walk on campus. He wanted to take a look at the art museum because I learned so much about him that day. He was an avid collector of art, and he knew a lot about art. And in fact, there was a poster, an obscure architect was giving a talk later that day. He actually knew who this architect was. So he was sort of like blowing my mind in terms of just how much he knew outside of clinical trials. But I was thinking about John as I was walking on campus a couple days ago, and I looked up and I saw this sign in front of the art museum, our shared humanity. And I just thought it was so kind of perfect because John was also very passionate about equality for all. And next slide, please. His charity was the Human Rights Campaign. And as part of the launch of this webinar, we are also supporting the Human Rights Campaign. And I love their tagline, breaking down barriers that divide us all. We're more powerful together than apart. And that is, it's so John. It's also representative of the spirit behind what we're doing with the Quality Consortium. So thank you all for being part of this inaugural webinar for the John Lee webinar series. And thank you for sharing this tribute to John Lee. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve now. You're in very good hands with Steve Whitaker. He was an early architect of our full body of work with our quality consortium. He's very humble and modest, but we wouldn't have what we have today with our AQC if it wasn't for Steve. So back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Patty, and welcome again, everybody, even those who have joined since we began. Today, we are going to focus on clinical quality management system optimization. The major sections of today's presentation, which we will be sharing significant content, so I will move briskly, but hopefully clearly on what we are trying to share in terms of a holistic approach for clinical quality management. So we will first share components of what is a leading practice that the Avoca Quality Consortium, in partnership with more than 100 member companies, have identified. We're going to look at what the ICH E6 Revision 2 implications are to quality management systems, the anticipated E6 R3, and what those concepts are likely to do for that, and how we will actually manage that as well. We are looking at and have been managing the implications of COVID-19, so we'll share that. We'll also look at, from a risk-based management perspective, where the regulations have been since E6R2, where they're going, and what COVID has implied, especially around quality management systems related to monitoring, source data verification, source data review. And we're going to share some inspection insights, and we gain those through members from the Quality Consortium. At the closure of today's meeting, we will be sharing the slides. Also, I think the audio will be available. And then the quality agreement template, which has been part of the consortium since its inception in early 2012, will be provided to attendees at the end of today's webinar. As we go through today's session, in the chat feature, if you have questions or comments, please use the chat feature, and we should have, hopefully sometime at the end of the meeting, to respond to some of those questions, and the ones we do not have time to do today, we will respond to following the session. Just quickly again to frame, where does the content and the insights come from for what we will be sharing today? The Avoca Group is made up of 5 major components. It's been a consulting and research services group since the late 1990s as it was created. So consulting and research activities brings tremendous insight into quality and compliance in the clinical conduct of clinical trials and other aspects of running clinical programs. The Quality Consortium has begun in 2011 and has brought together in a pre-competitive sense insights of leading practices. Those have been incorporated into online learning systems with Illuminate, into qualification platforms that are known as Diligent for qualifying service providers and CROs and other organizations. And most recently, the Innovation Alliance has been initiated in order to focus on the new technology, new innovative trial designs that are coming into play. The Avoca Group, therefore, pulls together subject matter expertise on leadership and compliance and quality, which has been our focus for clinical operations and quality compliance. We have the consortium construct, both the AQC and now the Innovation Alliance, that brings broad and deep relationships and shared learning and insights. And we have the practical work products, the tools, templates, leading practice materials that can be shared. Just as a quick image, you can view this on the Avoca Quality Consortium website, but these are the member companies of the consortium. And as I indicated, it's currently, I believe, over 130 member companies. As we go through today's session, we will have polling available to you. So right now would be an ideal time. If you do not already have the multimedia viewer open, on the right side of your screen within the ribbon of the WebEx, you should, if you're not seeing the multimedia viewer, you can click on the ellipse, which is the 3 dotted dots, and that will allow you to open the multimedia. And when you're in that, if you're in the WebEx app, you will see a polling feature in the right margin. But if you are in a web browser, you might see it open in a separate tab. Once you have that multimedia viewer open, you can click into it and you can enter your password, which is Avoca 2021 with the exclamation mark. Then you will want to enter your first name, last name, and click submit. Once you've done that, later in this presentation, we will have some polling questions and you'll be able to participate in that. The slides that you're seeing here, you will actually see the questions and the possible responses in the slide. And once that poll is presented, you will then be able, in the multimedia viewer, click on the polling question, select your response, and submit it. And once you do that, the results will become visible and you will see that changing response as others provide their response. So again, please now, if you haven't already and you're logging in, write down the password is Avoca 2021 with the exclamation mark. Okay, thank you. So let's get into the main part of the presentation. So first, let's look at clinical quality management system components as leading practice. This is an image that the Avoca Group has established as an industry-leading practice for how you manage clinical quality within your systems. And when we say systems, we are not talking simply of an IT system. We are talking people, process, and the systems that support that. In the dark blue on the left, you will see that there are 12 components that Avoca describes as necessary and appropriate components of a leading practice quality management system. First, at the top are quality agreements, especially between the sponsor and major providers like CROs, and also understanding what that might do in terms of carrying on to third parties that might be contracted through your CROs. The quality agreements have been in place for a long time in GMP, and they are also leading practice in GCP. The second item is quality metrics strategic framework. We see that most companies historically had metrics that had developed organically over time. But what we frequently see is a lack of a strategic framework that really focuses on outcomes that matter. And with the new guidelines of E6R2, and we'll get into this more, focusing on critical to quality factors, critical data, critical processes, and understanding the metrics that are necessary to not only know that the outcomes will be what you need, but do you have predictive leading indicator metrics? As a result of that framework, you should then have chosen KPIs and KQIs that align with that strategy. The policies and procedures should be integrated and managed in a risk-based fashion so that they actually align and provide the other activities and the support for the items that you see here in this quality management system. Vendor management and oversight is fundamentally important because there's almost no organization today that conducts clinical programs entirely on their own. They work with CROs, labs, investigative sites, other providers and vendors, and how does that management and oversight and how is it conducted? The training and how that aligns to the items I've already mentioned. As we know, ICH E6 Revision 2 is very focused on clinical risk management, focusing on critical to quality factors and preventing risks from becoming issues, especially relevant for patient safety and data interpretability. Knowledge management is where it is important to understand how you are a learning organization and how you, over time, prevent clinical study teams from repeating the same issues over and over. So do you learn from one therapeutic area, one clinical study team, and do others begin to adapt and refine? How does that play into your policies, procedures, your vendor oversight, and other metrics, et cetera, that are important for you? Also with knowledge management, it plays into, are the decision makers woven into your communication scheme such that when risks are coming up, are they tied in a timely fashion to make decisions? And when those decisions are made, do they get communicated effectively to all the stakeholders who need to operate consistently with those, even if those stakeholders are with your partner companies, your providers, your vendors, et cetera. Quality culture is where we look at the balance between how your organization prioritizes quality relative to speed, and relative to cost. We typically can find that speed may be a dominant factor and cost also may dominate. And how does quality in the culture truly play out? And then finally, the last three pieces is how do you manage inspection and audit preparation, not just at the moment of inspection, but how are you inspection prepared and ready on an ongoing basis throughout your program? Issue management and CAPA, even though we are focusing on risk approaches, there will always be issue management and CAPAs and what's the effectiveness of those. And then finally, the documentation and trial master files. And we know that trial master files are becoming more and more important from a regulator's perspective, especially in Europe, but even in the US with the FDA and other agencies like Japan, China, Canada, etc. And so how do those play into a good quality management system? So in the Avoca Quality Consortium, we have a framing and guidance and tools that focus on integrated quality management plans. And when we say integrated, there's no, again, single organization that conducts clinical trials on their own. So how do you integrate those quality management systems and quality management plans between sponsor, CRO, investigative sites, and other technical providers or other service groups, especially if you're even now beginning to use technologies, which might be, ePro or telemedicine or others? How do you manage that integrated quality plan? And those are made up of major categories like governance structures. How do you do the risk-based quality management around designing and building quality by design in upfront that focus on GCP and risk assessments and critical to quality factors? What is that joint quality management plan and the templates? So the consortium has leading practices for that. Risk-based approaches and how do you do the assessment and the monitoring and the tracking and the metrics? The communication management and how do those get communicated to the right people at the right time? Determination of those metrics, not only having outcomes or lagging metrics, but what are the leading indicators that allow you to take course corrective actions before risks become active issues? And then finally, what is your document management model, especially around process document control and your trial master files? One other piece around the clinical quality management challenge, and this is very, very key, is that there is a growing ecosystem and a division between that, where we have recognized that there's growing concerns in managing the disconnects in clinical trial execution because multiple stakeholders are implementing their own QMS solutions. So many of you work with not only investigative sites as an example, but site networks. And so they have developed their own electronic health record systems. They have their own quality management systems around those. They may or may not link in and align to the quality management systems that sponsors or CROs have around their EDC systems. So it's looking at those, the ecosystem of quality management between sponsors, CROs, investigative sites, the labs, pharmacies, technology providers, especially since more and more are now beginning to do decentralized trials or virtual trials, or at least hybrid trials with devices, telemedicine, things of that nature. How is that all managed? And so within that context, what constitutes source documents and how do you address these challenges that arise when the organizational policies and regulations conflict between each other? And so this is very important as we look at quality management systems and help member companies and others understand how to manage that. So let's look and dive into understanding what drives some of those risks and complications. ICH E6 Revision 2, we know, has been in place since November of 2016 as far as being published, and regulatory agencies in Europe adopted it in the summer of 2017. The FDA adopted it soon after. The PMDA in Japan, and now most regulatory agencies globally have adopted E6R2. And they now recognize that sponsors, providers, and others, including investigative sites, have had plenty of time to adopt and incorporate what they are requiring through these guidances. Now, proactive quality management is very much at the heart of what they're talking about. And the agencies want us to minimize risk through early planning and early signaling with metrics, things of that nature that are leading indicators, and to mitigate the problems or mitigate the risks before they become active problems or issues. They've also clearly indicated that there needs to be use of data and pre-established tolerance limits or quality tolerance limits for decision making. And they expect that to be executed through routine risk reviews. It is not adequate to do risk plans up front, never to be viewed again and never to be managed actively during the trial. They do also expect root causes for emergent problems and to indicate what the corrective actions were and why they could not or did not get prevented from a risk management perspective. Therefore, their focus is very much on risk-based strategies. And that means that they want to provide oversight of not only investigative sites, but also oversight of CROs and providers and others that's commensurate with risks that matter. So they've recognized that historically many risks that matter were overlooked by doing, let's say, 100% source data verification, because it became just a very rote review of source documents against the actual reported documents in EDC or other reported systems. But what was oftentimes missed was the real implications for patient safety data interpretability, because that was not the focus. So therefore, it is looking at, during the protocol development, what those high significant critical risks and critical to quality factors are, documenting those upfront as a chosen strategy of how you're going to mitigate those, how the roles and responsibilities such as monitors, centralized data management groups, and central monitoring activities or others are designed and developed to do a proactive risk prevention of those items. They want that to be documented upfront, and the roles and the oversight activities. They want it to be responsive and dynamic, no longer a static system that looks at these after the fact or when they've already become issues. So that ties to risk-based monitoring, risk-based oversight, risk-based inspection preparations, and other activities. From an oversight perspective, they made it very clear that sponsors and investigators retain the accountability for quality, even when it is contracted to providers. To continue very quickly, electronic systems, the validation, the quality control through qualified users is an expectation. And the reason that that's played out in E6R2 is because the guidance implicitly advises that organizations should move away from paper-based systems that tend to be lagging, that tend to be static. And they want us to transition to the automatic systems that allow tracking systems, real-time access, real-time assessments of risks, so that you can, in a more timely fashion, prevent risk to patient safety or data interpretability. They clearly also articulate that serious breaches need to be informed in a timely fashion. Now that you're doing it in a more timely fashion, they should be reported very rapidly to the regulators. And it also does not ignore the essential records around our COAC. Most everybody understands that that pertains to attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and they've added the complete aspect to that. And therefore, they're looking for those source and essential documents. An important piece, because of this new regulation, not only are patient records and site records and trial conduct records the essential documents, but your process documents, especially around risk planning, risk review, risk mitigation, requires traceability, not only of managing and monitoring those, but the decisions taken related to those. And those are now classified as essential documents. And therefore, you must now document all of those activities in your plans, your monitoring plans, your statistical analysis plans, central monitoring plans, et cetera. And those monitoring activities need to be traceable, documented, and you need to have within your clinical study report an end of trial clarification of how your quality management system was set up, managed, conducted, and what the findings and the insights were relative to that. So this sounds very complex, but it is actually very easy to do if you have an effective quality management system, as we had defined previously. Well, one oversight that many companies have very much done is around the factor that was defined and required in E6R2 around quality tolerance limits. As we do consulting projects with many clients and within our quality consortium, it is actually almost shocking how many organizations not only are not yet implementing the quality tolerance limit requirement, but also how much misunderstanding and confusion there is around quality tolerance limits. QTLs have historically been required for GMP activities for a long time. They infer limits whereby significant actions, and that's an important piece, significant actions must be taken to ensure that manufactured product achieves quality and usability limits. If they don't meet those limits, manufactured material may either need to be discarded or they need to go through reprocess steps very formally to be able to get them to the standards that are required before they can be released. So again, specific significant actions can be taken. So unlike how GCP historically was using key risk indicators, and I'll call it, ranges where they may or may not take actions, we infer that the guidances now imply that quality tolerance limits are at points at which actions must be taken. So therefore, now that regulators are using it for GCP, what is that expectation? So if we look closely at that terminology, so let's distinguish key risk indicators and thresholds related to those compared to parameters that have quality tolerance limits. So key risk indicators still are very applicable, but they are distinct and different from what the regulators are really focusing on for parameters and quality tolerance limits. KRIs relate to operational or critical data risks for trial execution. Thresholds are associated with those KRIs, and they detect potential issues that can be mitigated. And those thresholds, when met, appropriate action is taken or may be taken, but sometimes it may be decided that an action is not necessary. But those are still appropriate for those operational risks. From a quality tolerance limit standpoint, though, those QTLs are tied specifically to a trial parameter or variables being managed and viewed within that trial, and what are the risks associated with that. This is to be identified and defined when the protocol is developed and before patients enter the trial. That's the expectation of the regulations. The QTLs are to assess if systematic trend issues have occurred or they can occur, and whether action is needed. The risks identified are within the QTL, and the quality is adequate, and if it is adequate, then no action is needed, but if it is not adequate, then action should be taken. So a systematic trend issue means that it is something that is happening not by chance, but because of a systematic type of feature that needs to be managed, whether it's through protocol refinement, whether it's through training at sites, or whatever the case might be, to prevent that systematic trend or issue from recurring over and over. So what is the quality tolerance limit? It's a level point or value that's associated with a parameter that should trigger an action and evaluation to determine if there is a systematic issue. And for purposes of today's webinar, we're focusing on what the E6R2 guidance refers to. So in an image, basically over time, it is looking at your parameter and measuring that parameter and determining whether your quality tolerance limit is met. What we also talk about is actually secondary limits. And so the secondary limit is a lower limit whereby you detect that you are trending off scale and you want to take a proactive risk effort before the actual tolerance limit is reached. So it's preferential to actually make sure that you are preventing the QTL from being reached. I think I did just see a question come up about somebody saying, well, they think it should be systemic issues. the regulations clearly articulate systematic issues. Now, systemic issues are pervasive throughout, may be a systematic issue, but systemic issues don't necessarily have to be systematic. It might be things that are happening, but it's not based on the parameter and maybe a bias or a systematic error in terms of how it's being measured or managed. So there may be a systemic issue that's a real issue with your treatment, your therapy. If it's a true systemic issue because of that, then that is something that you need to deal with through the protocol and through the evaluation and the analyses. So I hope to clarify a bit there. So before the trial begins, trial planning stage, you need to identify the critical data and processes to the study objectives. It is best practice to limit the parameters that are of highest critical risk to patient safety data interpretability to 3 to 5. And you want to define the plans for those parameters and how to address the deviations from the QTLs. So what we're talking about, the parameters are most likely to be related to the primary objective data, secondary objective data, or patient safety data. It's unlikely to be related to exploratory objectives or process KPIs and KQIs. So you carefully select a very few key parameters that could jeopardize the study results or patient safety because of unintended bias. Therefore, you proactively consider mitigation steps that could correct the systematic errors if they occur in the parameters with the selected QTLs. So at the end of the trial, then, what the regulators will be looking for is a succinct, they're not looking for you to define or describe in a massive context your entire risk plan and all the things that you did to manage operational risks. But succinctly, they want you to focus on the parameters and the QTLs that you identified up front that had critical to quality factors around patient safety and data quality reliability. And they want you to summarize the QTLs, any deviations from those, the remedial actions, and the implications to the results. With that, we're going to open a polling question now. So the question is, what percentage of your clinical trials successfully have completed the adoption of ICH E6R2 within your organization and with your providers and vendors? So the polling question should open. You should be able to click on it and see the results. So as I see the results coming in, you recognize that a majority of organizations have not yet applied them to 100% of your trials. Only 17% say that they have implemented it on 100% of their trials. Many of you do not know, but there's even 20% who say from 0 to 24%. And you'll see that range there. So it's just, again, indicating how much more of an opportunity there is to address E6R2 in the approach that organizations are taking as they plan studies, design studies, set up risk plans, and manage that overall. Now let's go to the next polling question. The next question is, I have sufficient understanding of the following terms to help my organization effectively implement them. Now here you can choose more than one. So check all that apply where you have sufficient understanding. The polling question is open. You should be able to go and answer those. So it seems to be a fairly good understanding. The word metric obviously is most highly understood. It's coming in around 86%. Key indicators, about 3/4 indicate they have good understanding. But when you get to the parameter, you'll see that less than 2/3 have a clear understanding, and that's also true with the QTLs and the descriptions of thresholds related to those. Now, as we go to polling question 3, where ICH E6R2 adoption has not occurred, what are the top 2 pain points in implementation? So please select 2 of the choices here of where you see your top 2 pain points in adopting that. As we look at the results, risk-based monitoring and quality tolerance limits, as well as organizational change management and training. Actually, the OCM is the largest of them all. So almost 50% are coming in that is a major adoption challenge. And from my experience in terms of consulting projects, I am not at all surprised that getting the training and the organizational change management for adoption effectively within organizations is a challenge. But you'll see that QTL has kind of settled in as the second highest, most challenging item for that. And so there are consulting opportunities. There are things that organizations and the Quality Consortium has to help address all of those items, whether it's risk-based monitoring, quality tolerance limits, all of those vendor oversight activities, and a holistic quality management system. So please recognize that there are tools and opportunities to help your organizations more rapidly address those. So let's continue then. Not only is E6R2 now still not fully adopted and still been a challenge, but let me highlight on this slide the fact that if you've not yet fully adopted E6R2, and recognize that E6R3 is on its heels. And in fact, it is expected to have the first release of that in 2021. And the reason for that is that a couple years ago, and you'll see here, or a year and a half ago, in November of 2019, the final concept paper was published. And when it was published, they expected that within 18 months, they will begin to publish the final requirements for E6R3. So if you've not yet fully adopted E6R2, be aware that it's changing. What E6R3 is, it will be a full rewrite and reorganization of ICH E6 Revision 2. And that is what defines, according to regulations, GCP. Those are the guidelines for good clinical practice. They say it will, in that concept paper, they say it will be multifaceted. It will address GCP principles to increasingly diverse trial types. We know more and more there are adaptive trial designs. We're seeing basket or platform trials, especially in oncology and other areas. We're seeing the decentralized trials. We're seeing hybrid trials. So they are going to be prepared to begin to address those. Therefore, there's different data sources. We now have digital endpoints. There's more and more devices coming in, and those sources vary. It's no longer just electronic health records and or lab data. It's coming from multiple sources. The flexibility whenever appropriate to facilitate the use of the technology. So what the agencies want to do is to actually provide guidance for those changing activities. So therefore, the industry understands how to manage that. What they do expect to do, though, is to retain concepts and guidance in E6R2, especially around the risk-based approaches, the critical to quality factors, the critical processes and data, and all the concepts of the risk-based management of your trials is expected to be retained. But they will be modified and made relevant and adaptable for those variety of clinical trial designs and innovative technology and approaches. And they're also going to address what they have found, whether it's through inspections and other means, gaps and inconsistencies in prior guidances. When complete, the overarching principles and objectives document is expected to replace the current ICH E6R2. Annex 1 will address the traditional innovation or interventional clinical trials, and it will also replace E6R2. They've also indicated that there will be an Annex 2, and this will be completely new, and it will focus on the non-traditional interventional trials, again, might be adaptive trials, it might be basket trials, might be decentralized trials, etc. And that will be commencing once the principles and objectives document in Annex 1 are complete. So again, changes are coming. We are monitoring those. We will be reviewing those as soon as those are published. We will be looking at leading practice tools, materials, and be prepared to adapt those to make sure that the industry and through consulting efforts, people can and organizations can rapidly adopt what is changed based on those guidances. Now, having talked about changing guidances, we know that they have recently changed, perhaps temporarily, but some of them may be retained, especially due to implications of COVID-19. What does that mean? So when COVID began a little over a year ago, the situation created healthcare system strain, abrupt shift to virtualization, new processes and approaches were required. As a result, the FDA published guidances related to that, and they've been modifying those. And the European Commission and other agencies as well have also published recommendations, and those have been updated as new insights are gained. So it is important that companies stay current with the understanding of those guidances. And we have, through what Avoca Quality Consortium has done, in a rapid response working group sessions, which we did on a weekly basis last April, May, and June, and now we continue to do as leading change sessions on a monthly basis, is where we looked at the implications they were having. And by having the collaborative of the consortium, it was amazing and fantastic to see how member companies were wanting to share what was happening, to learn from others so that they could more rapidly address and align the needs. I won't go through all of these sessions, but you'll see that we had session 1 that began with the current state of site monitoring, which was an immediate issue because of lack of ability to get on site to do source data review and source data verification. It also had implications for protocol amendments, which was session 2. It had implications for documentation and management, not only of trial master files within sponsors or CROs, but also the investigative site files in maintaining inspection readiness. Session 4 was around what was shifting and changing for telemedicine, the IP supply chain, home delivery for those, also home nursing, e-consent, e-source, using devices, telemedicine, all those things. Session 5 was how to adapt clinical studies that must continue treatment or recruitment because of limited standard of care options. Session 6, because on each of the first 5 sessions, the source data review, source data verification concerns were so significant, it came up during every session, that on session 6, we did a deep dive. So there's tremendous insights. All of these insights from all of these sessions are published on the Avoca Quality Consortium website. And so if any of you are members of the consortium, that information is available and you can build those into your quality management systems and how you're adapting and refining your approaches. So the COVID-19 created not only challenges, but it created opportunities. There were many technologies, many systems that were available, like e-consent, telemedicine, other things that have been around long before COVID, but were poorly adopted or were not systematically and effectively adopted. So it's also an opportunity for the industry to more rapidly adopt those new technologies, which again is where the regulations in ICH E6 Revision 3, the agencies have even indicated a receptivity as they are now monitoring the COVID situation to how those are likely especially to impact Annex 2. So it's opportunities for the pharma biotech industry to collaborate together to rapidly and effectively capitalize on the new regulations and the benefits of those new technologies to help influence the regulators, service providers, healthcare providers, and technology companies and others in that regard. As we get ready to then focus on the last 2 pieces of our topics today, what are those options for monitoring and source data verification, source data review, especially since they became very impacted through COVID? We all are familiar, again, these are not new, but it defines more clearly, again, the need to have clarity on how organizations are transitioning away from 100% source data verification and source data review. And that is because since ICH E6 revision 2 has been out there, that's been part of what the guidances have indicated. They prefer that we shift away from what is not necessarily effective as source data review and verification to something more effective. So the proposals to include greater use of centralized monitoring for data analytics, review, and statistical review to find performance assessment, real-time analysis, and other factors that can identify those leading indicator metrics with tolerance limits to identify the acceptable deviations and to address them before the risks become issues. Also, the use of remote or off-site monitoring. Those have been available again from a site relationship and site management perspective, but how do they become more effective for trial progress, recruitment, investigative site files, et cetera? How do the follow-ups and the abilities to do that, especially if it requires redaction of information, it may add extra burden to the sites to do some of that. But we have insights about how to do remote off-site monitoring that's effective for the sponsors and effective for the sites. And how do you do virtual SDV, SDR via screen sharing and others, especially during controlled aspects that the regulations require. And of course, Europe has been more restrictive on this than the US, but understanding those is important. There's still the expectation that as sites open up, and many have, depending on the regions of the world that you operate, that site management on site is still important, but it should not become your primary focus. It should be supplementary in a complementary fashion to these other types of monitoring. One key thing that, and this is sourced from Transcelerate, that as they've looked at risk-based monitoring and trial quality, they've done this evaluation around source data verification because it's been very difficult to convince the industry to move away from 100% SDV. What Transcelerate has identified is that clinical trial sites have varying levels of experience and quality, but monitoring at 100% SDV approach across all of those sites does not manage the potential differences or take advantage of where quality is more assured at some sites than other sites. Research also indicates that 100% SDV is not effective at identifying material risk or critical to quality risks, critical to process or data implications, which is exactly where the regulations focus. There's a very low amount of transcription errors that impact data evaluability, but yet monitoring approaches have almost remained unchanged at many companies. The benefits of doing a more risk-based monitoring approach is targeted site monitoring and source data verification, where you actually do SDR and SDV based on where the highest risks are, either at the site level, some sites have greater risk than others, or at the patient safety data interpretability level. The risk-based monitoring does have impact on sites. It may reduce the amount of on-site time, but it does affect staff resources in other ways, especially if information needs to be redacted. It affects their processes, procedures, and training. It does increase remote contact time, but it might have less time in the bottom circle there on-site visits. So how does that balance between increased time for remote and less time on-site? So it may have budget implications, and understanding those budget implications and how to negotiate and work with sites on that is important as well. So these are important things to manage and develop into your quality management systems for risk-based monitoring. Finally, the last space is around inspection insights. The Avoca Quality Consortium, probably the most energized work stream that the consortium has ever had in its 10 years of existence, is around inspection experiences and readiness from member companies. So one quick image here, this is just a quick image of examples of what agencies inspected and didn't inspect to determine compliance. So on the left column in agency focus, it's not a surprise to most that they focus on the trial master files, monitoring, systems and data, site performance, documentation, the protocol and the deviations, and also the selection, qualification, and oversight of providers. But they approach them differently. And I don't have time today to share this, but again, you will have this slide deck, but you can look at this more closely and see how, as an example, I'll just use an example. The trial master file is a heavy focus of MHRA and the EMA, but to a less extent for the FDA, but they still do expect that it be available. But for the MHRA, they expect it to actually provide all answers and to be accurate, contemporaneous, having been developed and prepared and managed for all decisions and all activities throughout the conduct of the trial. And again, you'll see other differences here, which you'll be able to view later. So what are the case examples on the inspection experiences? For the trial master file, the completeness of that is important, directly accessible to inspectors where they come in and within 30 minutes want to be logged in and need minimal training, and they will dive in and actually review that. And even if they are not able to do on-site inspections now, they expect to get virtual access to that. They want to review original certified documents. They want to look at data integrity and audit trails. So again, paper TMFs are not their preference, electronic TMFs are. And the inspector access to unblinded content is expected. They want risk-based monitoring, not traditional 100% SDV. They're encouraging the adoption of the approach, the training of site and central staff to that, sufficient time to do it, and they look for governance and controls of that. From an oversight of CROs and other providers, vendors, they want data quality and integrity. They're looking predominantly at the critical to quality, inclusion, exclusion, primary efficacy and endpoints, and they're looking for the audit trails for the vendor systems, especially if you're using systems that do not have good audit trails sometimes, like the XLS format. As we get ready to close here, the industry challenges and opportunities, though, relative to the clinical quality management system and inspections, is that how do you understand and adapt to the regulatory landscapes E6R2 and anticipating E6R3? So how it will or have inspections occurred based on those guidances? The Quality Consortium has further insights on how they are doing that. But we recognize, as I've already highlighted, that there are some common but different expectations across the agencies. But we also recognize that those differences are reducing because we are now seeing agencies do joint inspections. So the FDA is joining the EMA, they're joining the MHRA during inspections. So they are beginning to see how those agencies use the eTMF and what the expectations are. So there are anecdotal examples of where the FDA is beginning to do some things similar to Europe. So if you have historical experiences with inspections with the FDA, it is not necessarily an indicator of where they're going in the future. So learning from those and applying the inspection experiences, not only within your own organization, because you may have limited numbers of inspections, but across the industry is key. And that's what the Quality Consortium and the consulting activities that Avoca does helps bring that more quickly and rapidly across partner companies and constructs so that you ensure that all stakeholders are ready for inspections. And that includes the use of leading practice processes, templates, tools, and as we saw in the polling question, the organizational change management so that behaviors are consistent with that. Areas that need further support, embedding risk-based quality management and quality management systems into your company and the CRO routine operations is oversight, ensuring accountability and traceability of decisions, incorporating those risk-based strategies and adjusting your monitoring reports and approaches to be consistent with regulations and expectations, ensuring that you are very rapid on serious breaches, that you use the dynamic approach to having the assessments and the central monitoring pieces to identify those, and ensuring that your essential records are not only uploaded to your eTMF toward the end of the trial, but that they are real-time, they're traceable, that they have audit trails, and that the inspectors can see that you did them at the appropriate time, and it wasn't something that you tried to build at the end to try to address gaps. So I'm going to open one more polling question here before we close today's session. And that is, what percentage of your studies are utilizing risk-based monitoring? So go ahead and take the polling question. So again, interestingly, even though risk-based monitoring has been around for literally more than a decade, and ICH E6R2 has been driving this concept since late 2016, you'll see that only 30%, less than a third, have applied it on 100% of studies. And you'll see that there are 1/5 of the trials that have not, or 0 to 24% is what the response is. So quite shocking, quite an opportunity. And from our vantage point, a risk, especially relative to future inspections and how agencies will view trials if they're not using proactive risk identification and management of your trials and patient safety, etc. So with that, I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but those of you from Avoca who've been monitoring the questions, if you have some questions, we can take a few now, and the rest of them we will respond to after the session. And again, you will be receiving a quality agreement template at the conclusion of today's session. Questions?
I do have a couple of sounds like there's an echo. Very close to the beginning of the presentation, the question was, when you say regulations, are you referring to E6R2?
E6R2, now the anticipated E6R3, but also since that time, E8 has had a revision 1. But we're not limiting it just to those regulations. Those are heavy drivers because they are GCP and they are the drivers of overarching umbrella aspects of clinical trials. But all of the E series of guidances, whether it's related to data management and other aspects, those are all part of what we include when we talk about regulation.
Okay, the next question is, I thought that the QBD and QTL will not be really detailed on ICH E6R2 or R3, and that's not released. What is the time frame?
So when the question says detailed, of course, regulations rarely define the exact how-to. They define the expectation that something be done, and then they expect the sponsor companies to define how it's being done and to be able to verify and validate that it is appropriate for the trial for the risks related to patient safety and data interpretability. So they will rarely define the exact how-to. What we have shared here are some of the industry leading practices that have been shared by our member consortium companies. Also, what Transcelerate has evaluated with their member companies and others. So what we've shared are industry leading practices and what we anticipate regulators are looking at, and we are refining those based on the inspection experiences that are coming in from consortium member companies.
And here's another really interesting one. I know we only have 2 minutes, but it says, how do you implement if the protocol is already being developed and the trial is running?
So that's a great question. Again, these expectations for risk plans during protocol development and quality tolerance limits being defined at that time relative to key parameters, that's not new. So if the trial has begun after the regulators have begun to expect companies to live to that, then it's basically applying that now. For trials that began prior to, let's say, the summer of 2017, it's still expected that you probably have gone back and incorporated those at that time point. But fundamentally, any trial that has started after the summer of 2017, when they are inspected, especially by Europe or the FDA, it's fair for the agencies to ask you to show that you develop those expectations and requirements during the protocol development. If you haven't, then it should be done after, at the most current moment. So with that, that's probably all we have time to do now. But we can certainly respond to other questions, and I'm sure those will be shared with the member companies through communications that follow this session. Any closing comments from Avoca?
Sure,
Yes.
this is okay. Just inviting all of our members to join us next week at the Leading Change meeting. It promises to be a very engaging and exciting topic. That's following up on the COVID-19. We moved into, as Steve said, the next year with additional meetings. So check our website, all of you, at www.theavocagroup.com, where you can find information about upcoming events. And we thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.